Hello again, and welcome to Global Exchange, part of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute's podcast network. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. On this episode, Bruce Stokes will take us through the results and implications of the November 8th US midterms. CGAI fellow John Parisella will then offer some observations, including their implications for Canada. Bruce is a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. No stranger to Global Exchange listeners, Bruce spoke to us recently, setting the stage for the midterms. I encourage you to read Bruce's insightful analysis on international affairs and the situation in the United States, and we'll link to some of his pieces as well as to the deck he's going to be presenting. CGAI fellow John Parisella also provides regular incisive analysis, especially on American affairs and why it matters to Canada, in both print and electronic media, and in both our official languages. Like Bruce, John is an old friend. I got to know John when he served as Quebec's Délégué Général in New York City. For many years, we also co-taught the US Relations course at the Canadian Foreign Service Institute. Welcome, Bruce and John.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Some context for listeners. What stood out for me, in contrast, fortunately, to some predictions, was the unremarkable nature of the actual US election process on November the 8th. Votes were cast, counted, and certified in orderly fashion. Turnout was less than it is for a presidential election, but for midterms, quite respectable at 47% of eligible voters. For Canada, we have 70 plus new legislators out of 535 in the US Congress, including new Democratic leadership in the House, as well as new governors and state legislators. With the review of the new NAFTA scheduled for 2026, we must maintain our campaign as to why we need to maintain reciprocal market access between the protectionist, because the protectionist instinct is a constant in US political life. We can also expect more pressure on Canada to increase our defense and security spending, increasingly, or especially in the North and the Arctic. So let's get started. Over to you, Bruce, for your, once again, these dynamic presentations with your decks.
Colin, thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation with John and with you after I share with you some data we have in the wake of the election. Before I start, I'd just like to echo your comments. I think that the election actually turned out to be a bit of a surprise to people. It didn't actually turn out to be either the Republican tidal wave that at some point people expected, nor did we see the kind of pushback from losers, except in one state in Arizona, that we feared, where people election deniers would challenge the outcome of the election. And we did not see the kind of violence that at least some people expected around the election, and actually public opinion polls had predicted might be possible. So I think that's all quite good. But let's look at some of the results. I think it's fair to say that surprisingly, Joe Biden was the big winner in this election. He was unpopular with voters on election day. These are the results of the exit polling we do in the United States, where we ask people after they voted a number of questions. A majority said they disapproved of Joe Biden as president, which was consistent with polling before the election. And yet, even people who somewhat disapproved of Joe Biden as president voted in favor of the Democrats by 4 percentage points. The role of Joe Biden in people's, their views of Joe Biden in terms of how they voted only affected those who strongly disapproved of President Biden, and those were overwhelmingly Republicans anyway. So it was surprising how little the perception of Biden affected people's votes, even though historically that had been the case in many previous elections. And this was largely because people said Biden was just not a factor to them, that other issues were important to them. We know what those issues are based on what people told us before the election. And as they walked out of the polling booth, It was inflation in the economy, number one, but it was abortion, number two. And again, this is one of the surprises of this election in the sense that the pollsters and the pundits had assumed that the abortion issue had peaked as an issue to motivate voters, that other issues that were around the economy were now more important. And in fact, among women in particular, among even white women, as well as Hispanic women, Black women, Asian American women, and younger women, abortion remained a very, very important issue in this election. As a result, Democrats outperformed past trends in the House, Senate, and governor's races. This is just to give you a sense of what normally happens in a first midterm election. As your listeners know, in the United States, we have an election every 2 years with all of the House of Representatives up for re-election and a third of the Senate. And as we can see, the Democrats lost seats in this first midterm election of the Biden administration, but they only lost 8 seats. The average is 28 seats. So the Democrats did much better than expected. They actually picked up a seat in the Senate, assuming they win the Georgia runoff that happens on Tuesday. At the very least, they will stay even. And they picked up 2 governors' mansions where they usually lose 5 in these kinds of elections. So overall, it was a surprising performance by the Democrats. And Donald Trump was one of the losers, especially among Republicans, where his favorability dropped 10 percentage points after the election. Views of him among Democrats didn't change much. He lost a little bit among independents, but the real decline was among Republicans. Now, bear in mind, 7 in 10 Republicans still have a favorable view of Donald Trump, but they seem to be a little bit frustrated with the party's performance, and they seem to be blaming Donald Trump. And a plurality of Americans now prefer Ron DeSantis to Trump as the candidate for the Republicans in the 2024 presidential election. Now, this is one poll there by YouGov and The Economist. There have been some other polls that showed slightly differently, and it is interesting that Republicans have actually shown a slight increase in favoring Donald Trump. It's just the overall population doesn't favor him, but favors Ron DeSantis. And because each poll is different, if you ask the question differently, this is a morning consult poll, 61% of Republican voters say Donald Trump should run. This is not a question of whether they prefer him enough, they say he should run. And 55% of Democratic voters say Joe Biden should run. I would caution you that before the election, a majority of Democrats said Biden should not run. Now, whether this is just a polling change, different wording, or this is an effect of he won the election for us and now we think he should run, we don't know. We'll have to see in future polling data. A second issue that I think we need to address is, was American democracy a winner in this election? As I said, there wasn't the violence some people had anticipated. There has not been as much post-election denial as might have been expected, although there is some. And Joe Biden twice gave major speeches before the election saying that American democracy was on the ballot. I must say, I personally thought that this was too esoteric of an issue, that the public would not respond to that appeal. But in fact, I was wrong. Joe Biden's instincts were right. And the polling data suggests that the defense of American democracy was high on voters' list of concerns. Bear in mind that the Republicans and Democratic voters have different concerns about American democracy. Republicans are worried that the wrong people get to vote. Democrats are worried that there's voter suppression. and outcome denial, and that's a threat to American democracy. But in both cases, it was a bigger motivator of the vote than I think people anticipated. And so it bears watching to see what this means in terms of the functioning of the democracy going forward. As Colin mentioned, the turnout was actually quite good. It was the second highest midterm election turnout since 1970. That's good. I think we have to bear in mind that if you look at these numbers and they go back to 1922, that it is quite common, in fact, normal, that only half or less, and normally less than half, of the American public vote in midterm elections. Only once did in the last however many years this is, 70, 80, 90 years, have half the population voted in midterm elections. We have a real turnout problem in these non-presidential years. But this last midterm election, the turnout was relatively good by historical standards. Nevertheless, about 6 million fewer people voted than in the 2018 election, the last time we had a midterm when the president wasn't on the ballot. So while the turnout was good, it was even better in 2018. I think the good news was that election deniers, and there were an enormous number of election deniers on the ballot from the Republican side, that election deniers running for election oversight positions, in other words, to be the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, which in many states means the person who actually runs the election, most of those election deniers lost. And people who were running for those jobs who weren't election deniers won. Now, I would caution you that there were well over 100 election deniers who won lower seats in the state legislatures, mayors, things of that nature, which suggests that they still will have an influence in 2024. But in the races for the people who are at the top of the pyramid of running elections in various states, for the most part, election deniers lost. But one other outcome of this election I think we have to bear in mind is that despite the Democratic success in this election, at the state level, America remains deeply divided between red and blue states, where political control is just resistant to change. Democrats won 15 of 17 states that Biden had won in 2020, and Republicans won all 17 states where Trump had been the winner in 2020. And this is a reminder that the United States is increasingly two countries, where the political control is divided between Republicans and Democrats, and that has all sorts of implications for policy, from social policy to tax policy, et cetera. And I think we have to ask ourselves another question about American democracy and the outcome of this election. Is this truly a democracy when incumbency seems to be baked in? In terms of the incumbency rate in 2022, 100% of the senators who ran for re-election won re-election. 96% of the governors who ran for re-election won re-election, 27 out of 28 who ran. And 356 of the 435 members of Congress who ran won re-election. So only about 20% of the seats in the House of Representatives were actually contestable by estimates before the election. So incumbency has become basically a ticket for a job for life. And I think that again, is that the kind of democracy that we at least studied in school and think we prefer in terms of these not being permanent jobs for politicians? So what lies ahead in this because of this election? One thing I think that people outside the United States and inside the United States need to remember is that 2 years into most administrations, there is significant turnover in leadership positions. It varies by administration, but there is generally a large turnover of cabinet members after 1 or 2 years, and even more in the third year, which we're heading into. The senior staff turnover is even greater because these are burnout jobs. We don't know who will be leaving the cabinet. We don't know who will be leaving the senior administrative positions, especially people in the White House. But I think it's a safe assumption that we'll see some turnover. That means new faces, new people to get to know, new influences on policy. The margin of control of the House matters because you need a very disciplined leader in the majority to maintain control over their majority. The Democrats had a very small majority in the last House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi proved herself to have an iron fist and strong control over her caucus. Whoever is the Speaker of the House for the Republicans, once they gain control in January, will need to be equally or even more so strong in terms of controlling his majority. The vote margin he may have will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 seats. That is not a big majority. It means that, to make an analogy, you only need 5 or 6 people who basically are the Joe Manchins of this House of Representatives coming in January. They can demand concessions for their vote. And we should remember that the last 2 leaders of the Republican Party in the House, Boehner and Ryan, both left their jobs because they couldn't control their minorities. And I think that we have to bear in mind that whoever wins this job as Speaker of the House, and it's probably going to be McCarthy from California, but it may be Scalise or someone else. The challenge they face in terms of controlling their party, especially the right wing of their party, is going to be a formidable challenge. And it's not at all clear that the Republicans are as controllable as it turns out the Democrats were. Despite all the concern about progressives in the Democratic Party, Pelosi kept them under control. It's not yet clear whether the Republicans can control their minority. We also should realize that in 2024, a third of the Senate will be up for re-election, as is normal, but there are twice as many Democrats up for re-election as Republicans. So even if the Democrats have a 1-seat majority in the Senate, and we'll know by Tuesday whether that's the case, the likelihood they will lose control in 2024 is pretty high. That bears in mind that it will lead to all sorts of positioning by the Democrats and the Republicans in anticipation of this battle for the control of the Senate in 2 years. On foreign policy issues, polarization is widespread on almost every issue, with significant priority differences on climate change, on immigration, even on China, where the Republicans put a much higher premium on that issue than do the Democrats, even though both Republicans and Democrats are tougher on China than their predecessors have been for many years. In terms of support for Ukraine, which is an immediate issue. The administration is asking for a $37 billion supplemental in this lame duck session of Congress to support Ukraine. There's even some talk in the Senate of boosting that a bit. Whether it passes or not, we don't know. But there is some thinking on both the side of the Republicans and the Democrats that getting money out of Congress for Ukraine next year will be more difficult because support for aiding Ukraine among Republicans is not as strong as it once was. And some of the most vocal voices in the Republican side want to actually reduce the aid to Ukraine. In fact, a third of Republicans in a September poll thought that the U.S. is giving too much support to Ukraine. And by November, in a Wall Street Journal poll, the number was at 48%. So even though it's only about half of Republicans who say we are giving too much to Ukraine, we maybe should cut back, and that's only half of a third of the population, because only about a third of the population are Republicans. Those are the people who are the core of the party. And so there's certainly an expectation in Washington that getting money for Ukraine next year is going to be much more difficult. And this begs the question of what we do about the reconstruction of Ukraine, which comes later. It's not this year, certainly, may not even be next year. But the fight over how much we support Ukraine reconstruction, I think, is going to be huge, with Republicans and some Democrats saying, no, we need to spend this money at home. So one of the challenges facing the administration next year is to begin to plan for the reconstruction of Ukraine and to mobilize allies to pony up the money to do this, because I don't think the level of support that the U.S. is now providing is sustainable over time, especially given Republican control of the House of Representatives and this growing sense among Republican voters that we need to cut back. On China, which I think is the other major foreign policy issue we need to worry about next year, the Republicans have been very clear. They want to create a select committee on China. They want to investigate everything that has to do with China, imposing tighter tech export controls. Remember, the Biden administration has already imposed some of the toughest we've ever done. They want to look into constraining outbound investment into China. They'd like to look at limits on cross-border data flows, further decouple supply chains. And so you can expect a lot of hearings on China, a lot of grilling of the administration on China. And while much of this will not ever result in legislation, because the administration, I think, will move more cautiously against China, you can expect some flashpoints. The incoming Speaker of the House, McCarthy, assuming he gets the job, has already said he's going to Taiwan. Well, if the Chinese responded to Pelosi going to Taiwan, one can imagine they will respond if McCarthy goes to Taiwan. And there are other issues that the Republicans would like to see, including sending more arms to Taiwan, which could become an issue with Beijing. Finally, I think we have to assume that the next 2 years are going to be ones of instability and dysfunction in Washington. Not as much as there would have been if the Republicans had gained control of both the Senate and the House and both big margins. But nevertheless, this was the 10th time in 12 elections that one or more of the Senate, House, or White House has changed parties. Bear in mind that in the 12 elections between 1952 and 1974, there were only 4 changes in control. We are an increasingly unstable democracy. And I think the analogies with Italy in the 1970s are becoming more and more apt. As I mentioned before, Republican control of the House will be razor thin, which means that Trump-affiliated Make America Great members will hold the party hostage on issues, and it could get pretty ugly. The budget, defense spending, both need to pass and will pass. If not this month, then certainly early in the new year. There will probably be some get tough on China legislation that passes. I don't know exactly what, but don't expect much more. And the fights over money for Ukraine will hopefully be postponed by a huge supplemental in December. If not, I think they'll get pretty difficult. One thing that goes unnoticed, I think, both in Washington and abroad, is that on an annual basis, Biden has issued more executive orders than either Obama or Trump. And when you can't get stuff through Congress, the temptation for American presidents is to issue executive orders. Now, that does get stuff done. The problem is that executive orders can be overturned on day one of a new administration. So Biden went off to Sharm el-Sheikh, promised to control methane emissions, which are very damaging to the climate. But if Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump are elected president in 2024, they could undo that, just as Trump undid controls that Obama had imposed by executive order on coal-fired power plants. So ruling by executive order is efficient. It's not democratic with a small d, certainly. And it does raise questions about the consistency of American policy over time, which our allies need to worry about. And finally, House of Representatives investigations will not be limited to China policy. They have already promised to open a new investigation into the president's son, Hunter Biden, and his business dealings with both China and Ukraine. I have no idea whether that'll lead to anything, but there'll be headlines, there'll be revelations, there'll be assertions that will, I think, damage American belief in support for Ukraine, for example, because it'll expose the idea that Ukraine is widely corrupt, which of course it was before the war. And we can also see investigations and possible attempts to impeach one or more Biden administration officials, the Attorney General, maybe the head of Homeland Security, and possibly, but probably not likely, an impeachment investigation of President Biden himself, which would never get through the Senate. But again, are all election ploys aimed at 2024 to besmirch what the election showed was actually a surprisingly strong president. So I think there'll be some incentive there for more attempts to raise doubts about Biden and his handling of everything from the Afghanistan pullout to how he deals with immigration. And with that, I'll close so we can get into some conversation here. Thank you.
Excellent, Bruce. As always, full of insights and revelations that only you can do for us. So thank you very much. John, let me turn to you now, and interested in your what you took from this. And you've we're both longtime watchers of the United States. How you see the midterms, and after some of your observations on what you found interesting in Bruce's presentation, what this means for Canada.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Bruce and congratulate him on his assessment. I must say that it was very accurate in terms, especially of the results. Clearly, the election deniers didn't win, but as he mentioned, there's a substantial representation of election deniers that got elected. In fact, I saw a number that may be subject to verification, but about a quarter of the House and Senate people elected are election deniers. So it's not as if it's going to go away. However, I totally agree with his notion that there were winners and losers. Clearly, Joe Biden won in terms of the results, resisting the red wave, and Mr. Biden now can decide whether he stays and runs for a second consecutive term. As you know, he turned 80 a few days ago. Bottom line is that he'll likely, if his health, his annual medical goes well, indicate an intention to go on. But I'm not quite sure that he will necessarily not reconsider somehow in the course of 2023. But depending on how the Republicans evolve post November 8th. The Republicans, from their end, they definitely didn't come out as strong as they wanted. Obviously, as Bruce mentions, they had a very narrow victory in the House, and Mr. McCarthy is running into some difficulties, and again, as Bruce mentioned, he will likely be held hostage on a number of issues by the MAGA group within the House. However, it does show there is dissension. The loser, of course, was Donald Trump, and I think this was generally the feeling the night of, and since, and even though he declared his candidacy in a speech that was as low energy as Jeb Bush was once referred to, he's gone into some controversy since his dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, the white supremacist. It wasn't just a 24-hour news cycle. It's made its way through a week now, practically, and it took a while for McConnell and for McCarthy to criticize, but clearly McConnell went further than McCarthy, but there's a lot of uneasiness, and of course the fact that Mr. DeSantis is making some gains in the polls indicate that that he is definitely a player. And now, will he run? That is another issue. It takes a lot of money, and as Bruce said, 7 out of 10 Republicans are still behind Trump. Trump still has control over the purse in terms of nomination, and probably it won't go away suddenly, but it will be much more complicated than 2016. 2016, it was a long shot, you might say, when he came down the escalator. But the bottom line is that he was up against probably one of the weakest array of candidates. So that'll be the issue that will decide whether Trump is the nominee in 2024, whether it's a repeat of 2016 with Biden versus Trump. I think it's still too early to say. Clearly, there's a sense that will likely be the more will be the more likely scenario. I'd just like to to give you more of a conversation, and this is not a presentation. I'd just like to say something, though, from a Canadian watching American democracy. I wrote a piece about 2 weeks after the election, or a week after the election, which basically said that I felt American democracy was functioning. I'm an optimist when it comes to American democracy, and I think the results showed that it was functioning. The abortion issue played its role. The democracy issue played its role, and yes, inflation played its role. So the House was essentially a referendum on Biden's performance regarding the economy and specifically inflation. But I think the Senate and the government races were guided a lot by the issue of abortion and the issue of democracy. I'll close by saying that I like to recall the 1960s, because I was a student and raised on American politics in the 1960s, and it's hard to find a tougher decade than that one. 3 assassinations of prominent leaders, the president, of course, of the United States, Mr. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, head of the civil rights movement, and Robert F. Kennedy, who was clearly the most charismatic politician of his day. We saw the Democrats tear themselves up in the convention that took place in '68. We saw the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw the campus unrest with respect to Vietnam and people leaving to come to live in Canada to avoid conscription or to avoid the draft. And we also saw how civil rights happened. And civil rights happened because there were enough moderate Republicans who went with moderate Democrats to pass civil rights. If there was two countries then, it was in America, it was then, and the Democrats were essentially, the segregationists in the South. And as President Johnson said when he signed, we've lost the South at least for a generation. It's been probably now more 4 or 5 generations. But the bottom line is that it was a very, very divided nation, and America come through. So I remain an eternal optimist about the future of democracy, but I concur with Bruce that dysfunction is certainly going to be the rule of the day over the next 24 months.
Thanks, John. And yes, I think back to the 60s too, and I would add just 2 other sort of movements that came out of that: the environmental movement, which has morphed into the climate movement, which we see continues to have transcendent effect, not just in the United States, but Canada, and certainly in Western countries in particular, but also in consciousness in China. And we've just been through Sharm el-Sheikh, so I think that's another thing. And then, of course, feminism and gender equality and rights fall. I think that was something that came out of the 60s, which really has now achieved, particularly in the West, but also we see implications elsewhere. It is a different world. So again, at a very divided decade, starting in the United States, but we're living with the consequences today, mostly good, but also some bad. And I think, as you point out, the divisions, and that 2 things that stood out for me, Bruce, in your slides, and I'm going to get you to comment a bit more, and that is your overall observation about democracy, which I think really is vital, because I do think the divide today is not between right and left, but rather between open and closed systems. And it's being borne out both in the very real conflict in Ukraine with Russia, but also in the, if not Cold War, at least the big divide now between the United States and China, with the rest of us lining up on either side. We've just come out with our Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's like, I read it the other day and I looked and I thought, gosh, I cannot remember a government ever being as tough on China as this government, and how far this government has come. This was a government that at one point Justin Trudeau said that the one country he admired in terms of systems around the world, it was China, very early in his political career. Well, he'd never say that again. And when you read the Indo-Pacific strategy, it reflects very much the sense of China as a strategic rival and a country with whom we will compete, which is reflected very much in the U.S. Foreign policy and defense strategy, as well as that now in NATO, where China has been identified. But Bruce, I guess 2 things which stood out for me and that one was about incumbency, and again, how remarkable that if you're elected, as you say, you're almost elected for life. And then the divide, as you pointed out, between red and blue. And well, I, like John, share optimism about the resiliency of the United States. And to me, that was, I've always been a bit found that the Chicken Littles who feel the U.S. is going down the tubes are wrong. I have faith in the American voter, and in part because living as I do some of the year in Florida, is that my neighbors probably all voted Trump, but they're all extremely decent Americans, and they're united by things like cheering for their sports and other issues, so that the political divide is not always the transcendent divide. In Washington, it is true that Democrats and Republicans don't get together, but I think in other parts of the country, the political divide is not the definer for most Americans. But I would pose that question to you. It may be an assertion on my part, but I'm not sure whether it's borne out by the evidence. So Bruce, is that political divide one that divides Americans outside of the Beltway, which is a bit of a cocoon, the definer?
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting is you have contradictory evidence, and so you can say, look, the glass is half full or half empty. When polls have been done, and when I was at the Pew Research Center, we did this poll periodically, and you ask people, do you want your politicians to stand on principle or to compromise with the other side to get something done. And what was interesting is that Republicans were more likely to say they want their politicians to stand on principle, and Democrats were more likely to say we'd like our politicians to compromise. Now, I think what was lacking in that data, you almost need another question and then to try to correlate it, is I think there are a lot of Republicans, and certainly there are a lot of Republican politicians now in Congress, who really don't believe in government. You know, they think the small government is the best government. That means also the less regulatory state and economy is the best. And so not compromising to get stuff done is not seen as a failure. It's actually seen as a success, because the compromising with the other side would mean you actually do something. You actually impose some new regulation. Maybe it's not as stringent as proposed by the left, but it's still, you know, it's still there. So I do think that there are some ideological divides all around those issues, and there are divides in the public opinion polls that where you ask people what you think of the other side, the other party, and a minority, but a disturbing minority of both Republicans and Democrats think the other side is a threat to the national welfare. So both of those things suggest we are pretty divided, and certainly on values, and Pew's been running these surveys now for more than 20 years, the values differences have never been greater. That said and done, I think if you, as you have suggested, Colin, if you ask people about their own neighbors, or you ask them about their own local politicians, they're much more likely to be, you know, nonpartisan and very supportive, et cetera. Now, the problem with that is there's also some data, I don't want to say it's conclusive, but there's some data that Americans basically want to live around people who are like them. Mm-hmm. So in a survey that was done by Pew a couple of years ago, we asked people, you know, do you want to live in a big house or a small house? Do you want to live in a neighborhood where you have to walk there, can walk to everything, or do you want to be able to, you know, in a bigger house and a bigger lot, but you have to drive to everything? And in essence, Republicans and Democrats wanted to live in different neighborhoods, which I think implies that you end up on a daily basis basically interacting with more people who are just like you, who think just like you. So while there may not be as much partisanship at the very local level, that may be a product of decisions that people made about where they wanted to live. Now, I agree with you and John, and you know, the 1960s, which I lived through, were a very convulsive time, and we got through them, even though, you know, things seemed very apocalyptic at points. And I know my wife always argues this with me, that, you know, look, we lived through the 60s, we'll get through this. And, you know, we should be mindful of that. I guess because my background is a journalist, and we were paid to always say the glass was half empty. That, and she was a politician, and she always said the glass is half full. That I think that we have to worry that this isn't a time like the last. We have to make sure it isn't, that we get through this. And I mean, certainly the way we've overcome civil rights, the way, you know, we've all become environmentalists now, and we're all three of us are old enough to remember when environmentalism was this fringe idea. I mean, I remember I grew up in a steel town where periodically the stream would turn orange, mm-hmm. and nobody complained. You know, nobody said water's not supposed to be orange, but it was the steel mill dumping stuff in the water.
Exactly.
And you know, I think so. The potential for change is great. I think one of the disturbing factors about American life is that on a number of social issues, we really are becoming two countries in the sense that depending on where you live, you can get an abortion or you can't get an abortion, right? And we'll see what happens around gay marriage and gay sex and things like that, where there are at least some people on the extreme right who want to pursue the same strategy as they have on abortion and make this at the state level illegal. Certainly, there's been a weaponization of some of these social issues at the state level. We have a Republican governor of Virginia who won in part by saying, he was against teaching critical race theory in the schools. Well, nobody in Virginia was teaching this, but it had a powerful divisive nature to it that led to his election. And I think we're going to see more of that. Ron DeSantis in Florida has been going after transgender kids and things of that nature, which I think, again, we could end up having two countries where you just cross the border and a whole other set of social norms apply. So I do think that is disturbing. But to go back to your point, when I was growing up, if I drove 500 miles from Pennsylvania to the south, there was a totally different.
It was a different country.
Yeah. It was a different country. So, I mean, I remember going to the south to work in a political campaign in 1970. And what was striking to me as a Northern liberal, naive boy, was that you could tell you were in a Black neighborhood when the sidewalks stopped.
Yeah.
Because nobody built sidewalks for Black people. It's like, these just norms that you expect in a civilized society didn't apply. And I think that's one of the challenges we're going to face going forward, is to make sure that it's the same country across the board.
Yeah, maybe I'd just like to jump in, Bruce. I concur with a lot of the stuff you said, but again, if we go north of the border, Canada is not what it was before either. We have a conservative party that's led by a leader who's more Trumpist than Mulroney was, and we have a sovereignist party, a pro-separation party in the House that sounds more and more like the conscience of the House on issues, never talks about separation. We have a Liberal Party that's now in alliance with the NDP. It's not a coalition government, but they're going to be there probably for the next 2 years in a coalition. So I think it's changed. My experience in Quebec, there was a time when I actually was at the heart of two major issues: language policy and the constitutional future of Quebec. And we were basically two parties: pro-separation party, Parti Québécois, and the Liberal Party, pro-federalist. Today, we now have 5 parties in the last election, and the parties that got the least number of votes, popular votes, was the PQ, the Parti Québécois, and the Liberal Party. And we're headed by a party that didn't exist 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So I think we're living through a period, and maybe some of the research that is done forgets to perhaps assess the role of social media in developing conspiracy theories and alternative points of view. But I'd like to just make a comment regarding the relations between Canada and the United States, and I think that's very important. And I think my friend Colin, knows that the new NAFTA, we refer to it as USMC, CMC, the USMC deal is up for renewal in a couple of years, and we know that we've had Mr. Trump saying that the NAFTA deal, the original NAFTA deal, was the worst deal ever, and he wanted to opt out. And finally, we got a new deal, and it's signed by the Mexico, Trudeau in Canada, and Trump just before I left. And then he brings in tariffs on steel and aluminum, which of course affected Canada and its exports. So Canadians in the United States, the embassy, the general counsels, the Quebec offices got together, and they lobbied a lot of the politicians in the Midwest that were most needed most of those exports from Quebec, and finally the tariffs were dropped. So in other words, what I'm basically saying is that the relationship between Canada and the United States requires permanent economic diplomacy, not on the verge of a new deal, not because there's a crisis, but even when things are good, because as Colin said earlier, the protectionist buy America will always be there, except there was a time when it was associated with one party. Now it's associated with the two parties. So I think if there's any message that I get from your assessment about what's happening in the United States is that Canada cannot just be looking at the United States by our CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News feed. We have to be on the ground talking with American legislators, American opinion leaders, American media, and sectoral associations. So that means to say that chambers of commerce have to visit, sectoral associations have to visit. We have to be in constant contact. That's one thing that we can thank Mr. Trump for. He created a need for permanent economic diplomacy between Canada and the United States.
And I do think that, an evidence of how that has worked most recently is in this Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, where the Macron is in town today complaining bitterly about the subsidies but to electric vehicles that are in that bill, but they only go to automobiles that are built in the United States and, by the way, in Canada or Mexico, right?
Yeah, a North American platform.
Yeah, you're exempt, and I didn't follow that closely when it was being crafted on Capitol Hill, but I'm sure there was an enormous amount of input, both from American business who brings stuff in from Canada when they're building stuff, from Canadian business that says, look, we're part of a supply chains here. We're not, separate entities. And frankly, again, I don't know the history of this, but the Europeans dropped the ball.
They did, and I think that's exactly right. And I think that, we have to lobby hard, and we've been doing this bluntly since 1965. In the case of the auto trade, providing for free movement between the companies and working with the labor unions, which is exactly what we've got to do. But Bruce, I guess the question I posed to you, and I realize this was beyond what about, are we right that the attitudes of Americans in both parties it now tends to be protectionist?
Well, I think my personal view is, having spent 25 years of my life being a trade reporter from the National Journal, is that protectionism is the wrong word, and it's outdated. It carries all this freight, right? As if you're either protectionist or you're a free trader. Well, the reality is all of us have certain economic interests that we're going to pursue. And frankly, around this IRA thing, it's not really that we're pursuing solely economic interests. We're pursuing climate interests. We're trying to subsidize electric vehicles to get consumers to buy them so that we can make the climate transition we need to make. And I dare say when you hear from Europeans, for example, complaining about these subsidies, I'd like to hear from the European climate community, because frankly, it's in their interest and the world's interest that the US get off the gasoline automobile and onto electric vehicles. So I think we're all going to be protecting certain interests. Everybody has politics. Everybody has voters who need jobs. And I think that we have to acknowledge that we all have politics we have to address. We all have employment that we need to help stimulate and generate. And that, most importantly, that the theory of free trade and the theory of markets in general is that the only interest is the consumer interest. And if we can, build a widget 10 cents cheaper in China, we should move our production to China. Well, in fact, that's only consumer interests are not the only interest that any society should have. Employment is an interest, the environment is an interest, community stability and a future for communities is an interest. And we've allowed all of that to, in the past, to be ignored by a simple bottom line mentality and the kind of philosophy of free trade and comparative advantage, which I think as a friend of mine, Bob Kuttner, once wrote, in the classic example that was used about free trade, that England would make textiles and Portugal would make port, because they get specialized in those two things, and then they would trade them. Nobody asked the Portuguese if they want to be relegated to be port makers for the rest of history. And let's face it, we all want to like move up the value chain and do more things, and that requires protectionism, maybe, but it's also saying that there are other interests than just bottom line stuff. But then it gets really difficult because it's simpler to just say free trade, or if we don't have free trade, then everything's protectionist. And I think that conversation is changing. Industrial policy in the United States is no longer a dirty word. Yeah, and I think that we're all going to engage in more quote unquote industrial policy, more subsidization. I think what we should be debating now among ourselves, among the Canadians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, is we need a subsidy code. What is a legitimate subsidy? What is an illegitimate subsidy? Rather than saying, well, any subsidy is bad. And that's old thinking, I think.
Well, I'm following a lot what's happening in the United States post November 8th, and I'm encouraged by the fact that there was a bipartisan vote on same-sex marriage, and I'm also impressed by the fact that on the potential rail strike that could happen in about a week from now, there seems to be bipartisanship emerging there. I think the question of keeping the government open and debt ceiling, I think, will also result in bipartisanship, so I'm actually following what's happening in the United States. Mr. Trump, a couple of years ago, would have gotten away with a 24-hour news item with dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, and now it's been lasting about 6 days. So I'm streaming a lot or following a lot what's happening in the United States, and much as I share many of the reservations that Bruce brought forward, I remain fairly optimistic that the American checks and balances, which we saw in some court rulings recently, including Trump's tax records and other issues, and the fact that the January 6th report will also be rendered public soon, and that won't go away. It won't be something that will simply say it was partisanship at its worst. It was actually there's some clear testimony that's come from people who were close to Mr. Trump. So I think we're living through an interesting period, and the dysfunction, yes, I think will continue, but America is always working towards a more perfect union, and I remain an optimist.
Thank you, John. Bruce, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, I'm watching too much Netflix and Amazon. I can't even, none of it's memorable enough to remember what I was watching, but I still watch a lot of it. And I read detective novels as a way to relax in the evening. So Michael Connelly's newest book is what I'm reading now.
Oh, good. Is it one of the Bosch ones?
Yes, one of the Bosch
Yes.
ones. Yeah.
Well, the Bosch series I thought on Netflix was excellent.
It was excellent. I hope they continue it because it was really quite good.
And like you, I'm rereading for about the third time Anthony Price, who wrote wonderful novels. He's a British writer, spy novels, written in the 70s and the 80s, and they're little gems. And so I back those. And as we finished the last series of The Crown, and last night my wife said for fun we watched Lindsay Lohan's return in A Christmas Festive. It was just pure schmaltz, but
I'll tell you, watching the tree light up at Rockefeller Center for this is 90 years in a row. I was there at least on a couple of occasions, and it brought memories. But yesterday's tree was unique in itself, 82 feet high, and it was just encouraging. It certainly brought the holiday season and obviously readings that will be outside of politics for the next month anyway.
Yeah, I
there's a
realized
wonderful,
that
there's a
I
tree
was
that goes to
oblivious.
Boston every year from Halifax, which I think they lit on the weekend as well.
Yeah.
Going
Good.
I
back to
realized
the,
that I had missed both lightings, both of that tree and the one in Washington, and I'm thinking, what? I mean, how old am I getting that I don't pay attention to this anymore, right? I should be paying attention.
all right, gentlemen, thank you. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
listening to this episode of
Appreciate
the
it.
Global Exchange.
Thank you very much. Nice meeting
Take
you,
care.
Bruce.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Charlotte. Take care.
We were
Bye-bye.
joined today by Bruce Stokes and John Parisella, and we will link to Bruce's deck and to recent pieces by both Bruce and John. You can find the Canadian Global Affairs Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and the CGA network on iTunes and Google Play. The Global Exchange is brought to you by our team at CJAI, and as always, my thanks go out to our producer, Charlotte Duval-Lantoine, and to Drew Phillips for providing our music. I'm Colin Robertson. Thanks for joining us today on the Global Exchange.